Every survival calculation you make in the Cretaceous eventually collapses into the same problem. You can avoid the tree line. You can stay out of dense vegetation, resist the instinct toward cover, keep yourself in open terrain where at least the threat is visible before it reaches you. You can learn the territory ranges of the large theropods and route around them with enough lid time to matter. You can adapt to the intelligent hunters, develop awareness of coordinated behavior, stop moving at dusk. All of that is learnable. All of that represents genuine survival logic applied to a hostile environment. The problem is that none of it addresses the one biological requirement that doesn't negotiate. The one resource your body will begin demanding within hours and will make increasingly poor decisions to obtain within days. You need water. The ecosystem was already aware of that. Every large predator in the Mesozoic that operated near water didn't choose that location arbitrarily. Water sources were the one fixed point in the landscape where prey behavior became entirely predictable. Animals that had survived every other threat in the environment, that had learned appropriate distances from theropods, that had developed sophisticated herd warning systems, that had spent millions of years calibrating their threat responses, still had to drink. And the moment they approached water, that entire behavioral architecture compressed into a single, exploitable pattern. They came to a specific location. They lowered their heads. Their attention divided between drinking and scanning, and they stayed long enough for something patient to matter. Patience was a resource the animals waiting at the waterline had in considerable supply. Sarcosuchus imperator is the entry point here, because it reframes what a crocodileform ambush predator actually represents at Mesozoic scale. Modern saltwater crocodiles reach lengths of around 6 meters on the largest recorded specimens. Sarcosuchus, operating in early Cretaceous Africa and South America, roughly 112 million years ago, reached an estimated 9 to 11 meters in length, with a body mass approaching 8 tons. The skull alone measured nearly 1.8 meters. The eyes were positioned toward the top of the skull, elevated, dorsally placed, allowing the animal to maintain visual contact with the surface while keeping the entirety of its body submerged. The bony scutes covering its dorsal surface broke up its surface profile in water, and in the sediment-heavy river systems of Cretaceous Africa, the water itself provided the remainder of the concealment. What Sarcosuchus represents mechanically is a near-perfect sensory asymmetry. It could see you approaching the water from a submerged position before you had any reliable mechanism to detect it. The waterline, the specific zone where you needed to be to accomplish the one thing keeping you alive, was the zone with the least visibility into what was already occupying it. You were scanning a surface. It was watching from beneath that surface. The information imbalance in that exchange resolved in one direction only. The ambush itself followed mechanics that modern crocodilians have preserved almost unchanged across 200 million years, which is its own quiet argument for how effective the strategy was. Explosive lateral acceleration from a static position. Contact before the prey's motor system has processed the initiation of movement. A death roll designed to destabilize and disorient, rather than immediately kill, because a prey animal that cannot orient itself cannot coordinate an escape response. Modern crocodilians can cover the distance between submerged concealment and a drinking animal at the bank in under a second. Sarcosuchus had the same mechanical template at roughly twice the scale. Caprosuchus adds a different dimension that's worth pausing on. Unlike the ambush from water model, Caprosuchus was a fully terrestrial crocodileform, long-legged, upright postured, built to move efficiently on land. It didn't need to wait at the water. It could follow you away from it. The crocodileform threat in the Mesozoic wasn't contained to the waterline in the way modern crocodilian danger is geographically bounded. The family had members distributed across aquatic ambush and active terrestrial pursuit. The water was where the danger concentrated, but the architecture of the group meant it wasn't where the danger stopped. Then there is Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, which requires a different framing entirely. Spinosaurus is frequently presented as an aquatic predator, the largest carnivorous dinosaur yet discovered, repositioned by recent fossil evidence into a semi-aquatic ecological niche. The updated picture, built from density analysis of its bones, the structure of its nasal openings, and the proportions of its hind limbs, shows an animal that was genuinely at home in water in a way no other large theropod was. Dense bones provided ballast for submerged movement. The conical, interlocking teeth were structured for fish capture rather than the tissue-tearing dentition of purely terrestrial theropods. The limb proportions suggest it moved more efficiently in water than on land. At 14 to 15 meters in length, and a mass estimated between 7 and 20 tons, depending on the model, Spinosaurus in water wasn't behaving like a terrestrial predator that had learned to tolerate aquatic environments. It was operating in the medium it was built for against prey that was not. The specific danger Spinosaurus introduced wasn't just its size or its dentition. It was the collapse of the land-water boundary as a meaningful safety threshold. Most large terrestrial threats in the Cretaceous were constrained by their own terrestrial architecture. A T-Rex at the bank of a river was still a terrestrial animal navigating water as an obstacle. Spinosaurus wasn't. The river wasn't a barrier between you and the threat. The river was where the threat was most capable. Your instinct to use water as separation, to cross a river to put distance between yourself and a land predator, was operating on an assumption the Mesozoic had already invalidated. There is a further problem that compounds everything else, and it operates below the level of the dramatic predator encounter. It operates at the level of the water itself. Cretaceous river and lake systems weren't clear. They were sediment-heavy, organically dense, murky in the way that slow-moving tropical waterways are murky. Visibility measured in centimeters below the surface in many conditions. Banks obscured by vegetation that reached the waterline, the bottom invisible at any meaningful depth. You couldn't scan the water you needed to drink from. You could observe the surface and derive almost nothing reliable about what occupied the volume beneath it. The sensory information available to you at a Cretaceous waterline was the surface, the immediate bank, and whatever your hearing could extract from background noise. That was the complete picture. Everything else was inference. And inference in that environment was a gap that had been occupied for millions of years before you arrived. The Crocodileform family had been exploiting that specific sensory gap since the Triassic. By the Cretaceous, the waterline ambush had been refined across over 50 million years of predator-prey pressure into something close to optimal. The concealment was better. The acceleration was faster. The prey detection systems were more sensitive. the ecological intelligence embedded in the behavior, where to position, how long to wait, how to read the surface disturbance of an approaching animal, wasn't learned by individuals. It was encoded. The animals waiting at the waterline weren't making decisions. They were executing a biological program that had been pressure tested against every prey species in the ecosystem for longer than most lineages had existed. You were a novel entry in a system that had been running without interruptions since before the dinosaurs achieved dominance. The system didn't need to adapt to you. You were, in every measurable sense, already a solved problem. The water didn't become dangerous when you approached it. It was dangerous before you were thirsty. It was dangerous before you arrived. It had been dangerous in the specific and refined way that only time produces, since long before the Cretaceous began. Your biology guaranteed you would approach it eventually. The ecosystem simply waited, the way it had always waited, for the interval between your arrival and your need to close. And it was never a long wait. Everything discussed so far had an implicit assumption running beneath it. On land, there was always something you could do. The decisions were bad. The forest was a trap. The open ground exposed you. The water was occupied before you reached it. But they were still decisions. You could move. You could adjust direction, modify behavior, respond to new information about the environment. The terrain had features you could use, even if those features ultimately worked against you. Elevation changes, vegetation density gradients, the acoustic properties of different ground cover. Even at the waterline, with the Sarcosuchus motionless beneath a surface you couldn't read, you were still a terrestrial animal in a terrestrial environment, making terrestrial choices. The options were poor. They were still options. The ocean removed that category entirely. Opened water in the Mesozoic wasn't a more dangerous version of the land environment. It was a different type of problem, one where the survival variables that had any relevance on land became either irrelevant or actively counterproductive. Cover didn't exist. Terrain didn't exist. Vertical movement, which on land represented escape, climbing, elevation gain, getting above the threat, in water represented approach. Moving upward in open ocean meant moving toward the surface, which from the perspective of anything operating beneath you wasn't escape behavior. It was target behavior. Every instinct your body carried into the water was either useless or wrong. And the things waiting in that water had been there in various forms for considerably longer than the instincts were accurate. The Western Interior Seaway split North America longitudinally during the late Cretaceous, a shallow inland sea stretching from what is now the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean, covering the central continent under water that reached depths of roughly 800 meters at its deepest points. It wasn't the open Pacific. It was a contained body of water, geographically defined, with coastlines on both sides. And it was, by any reasonable ecological measure, one of the most densely occupied predatory environments in the history of vertebrate life. The food web was structured from the surface to the bottom, with large predators distributed across every depth gradient. There was no safe depth. There was no safe distance from shore. There was no region of that body of water where the predator density dropped to something manageable. Mosasaurus hoffmanni occupied the upper register of that system. Estimates place large adults at 13 to 17 meters in length, though some fragmentary evidence suggests individuals may have exceeded that range. with a body plan that combined powerful lateral tail propulsion with 4 paddle-like limbs, providing directional control. The jaw structure was double-hinged, incorporating an intramandibular joint that allowed the lower jaw to flex outward during prey capture, dramatically increasing the effective gape and the volume of material the animal could process in a single strike. Mosasaurus also had a second set of teeth on the palate, pterygoid teeth positioned on the roof of the mouth, that functioned as a ratcheting mechanism, preventing prey from moving forward out of the jaw during swallowing. Once the initial contact was made, the mechanical architecture of the skull was specifically designed to ensure that contact became permanent. The sensory system matched the offensive capability. Mosasaurs had forked tongues, confirmed by skull morphology, functioning analogously to modern varanid lizards, providing chemosensory tracking capability in water. They could follow chemical gradients. They could track prey that had moved through an area without being physically present at the time of detection. The ocean you were swimming through wasn't neutral space. It was a medium actively carrying information about your presence to animals you hadn't seen and couldn't locate. Plesiosaurus funke, informally designated Predator X before formal description, operated in the Jurassic seas of what is now Europe and represents a different mechanical philosophy applied to the same ecological role. Where Mosasaurus was built around speed and jaw mechanics, Plesiosaurus was built around bite force and pursuit endurance. Estimates for its bite force reach approximately 33,000 newtons, comparable to large theropod measurements, in an animal operating in a medium that removed all the friction-based escape options land terrain provided. The skull reached up to 2 meters in length. The neck was short and heavily muscled, designed to generate rapid head movement during a strike rather than the long-reach capture mechanics of some other marine predators. Plesiosaurus didn't need reach. It was fast enough that reach was irrelevant by the time the strike initiated. Elasmosaurus platyurus took the opposite morphological approach and arrived at something arguably more unsettling. The body was relatively compact, perhaps 14 meters total length, but roughly half of that length was neck. 72 cervical vertebrae producing a neck that could reach 7 meters, flexible enough for significant lateral and vertical range of motion, attached to a body that remained stationary or at depth, while the head worked the water column above and around it. Elasmosaurus didn't need to close distance the way a pursuit predator did. It could investigate a volume of water around its body position without moving in a way that produced the pressure wave disturbance that signals approach in aquatic environments. The neck reached, the body waited. By the time you registered the geometry of what was happening, the geometry had already resolved. The attack from below mechanic requires specific attention because it inverts the threat model in a way that land environments don't replicate. On land, threats approached from the horizontal plane. Your visual field, your hearing, your spatial awareness were all calibrated toward lateral detection. Movement at your level, closing distance across terrain. In open water, the largest and most capable predators approached from beneath. The surface above you was light and visible. The water column below you was dark, depth graded, and at any meaningful distance from the surface, completely opaque. You could see sky. You could not see what was below you. And the animals had developed the specific anatomical and behavioral toolkit for using that opacity as a hunting medium. The mechanics of an upward strike in open water are almost perfectly efficient from the predator's perspective. The prey is silhouetted against the surface light, clearly visible from below in a way the predator is not visible from above. The approach vector is vertical, which means it doesn't intersect with the horizontal detection plane the prey is monitoring. The acceleration phase is assisted by the direction of travel. Moving upward in water involves the same mechanical dynamics as a controlled ascent, which large marine predators executed with their entire body mass behind the movement. The prey animal at the surface had no warning signal that was reliable, no terrain feature to use for deflection, and no direction to move that meaningfully increased the distance. Moving down meant moving toward the threat. Moving laterally maintained depth, while the predator covered vertical distance. The surface itself, the boundary the prey was trying to stay near, was the delivery point the attack was designed to reach. Dinosaur Profiles, another large mosasaur reaching up to 13 meters, demonstrated behavior preserved in the fossil record that clarifies exactly how complete the predatory dominance of this environment was. Stomach contents from Dinosaur specimens have included fish, smaller mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, birds, and diving marine turtles. The diet wasn't specialized, it was comprehensive. Dinosaurus was eating everything in its size range and a meaningful portion of things outside it. The ecological implication is that the Western Interior Seaway wasn't an environment with a defined predator-prey structure where certain organisms occupied safe niches. It was an environment where the predatory pressure was distributed across the entire water column and applied to essentially everything that moved through it. Kronosaurus queenslandicus in the waters of Cretaceous Australia brought similar dimensions to the southern hemisphere. A pliosaur reaching 9 to 10 meters, with a skull approaching 2.5 meters, operating in the shallow epicontinental seas that covered much of what is now inland Australia during the early Cretaceous. The geographic point matters because it reinforces something important about the scope of the problem. The Western Interior Seaway was not an anomaly. The Mesozoic marine predator density wasn't a regional condition. The Tethys Sea, the waters surrounding the fragmenting Gondwana supercontinent, the shallow epicontinental seas that covered large portions of every landmass during sea level high stands, all of them supported predator assemblages of comparable scale and density. The ocean wasn't dangerous in specific locations. It was the ocean. The entire connected body of water covering most of the planet's surface was running the same ecological program simultaneously. There is a spatial reality to open ocean that doesn't register until you consider it in terms of escape geometry rather than surface area. On land, distance was meaningful. Putting kilometers between yourself and a threat required effort, but produced a real change in the predator's detection probability. The terrain provided intermediate obstacles. The distance itself represented time. In open ocean, distance didn't work the same way. A large mosasaur could cover 100 meters in a time interval that land-based distance calculations didn't account for. In a medium with no obstacles, no terrain features producing cover, no elevation changes providing concealment. The water was flat in every direction. Your movement through it produced a pressure wave and a chemical trail and a visual silhouette against the surface light. You were not moving through neutral space. You were moving through a medium that was transmitting your location in multiple sensory channels simultaneously to animals distributed throughout the water column. The distance you could put between yourself and the nearest threat was not the relevant measurement. The relevant measurement was the detection range of the things you couldn't see, minus the time required for them to close from that range to contact. In most scenarios involving large Mesozoic marine predators, that calculation produced a number that wasn't useful to you. Which returns to the point made at the beginning. On land, there were decisions. Bad decisions, increasingly constrained decisions, decisions that the environment had structured against you in ways that took chapters to fully articulate. But the category existed. You were an agent making choices in a hostile environment, and the choices had outcomes that varied. The ocean didn't offer that. The ocean offered entry and the consequences of entry, with no meaningful decision space between them. The marine environment of the Mesozoic wasn't a place where better choices produced better survival outcomes. It was a place where the act of being present was the mistake, and everything that followed was just the ecosystem processing that mistake at whatever pace it found convenient. You didn't die in the Mesozoic ocean because you did something wrong. You died because you were there, and the water had been there longer.